Welcome, everyone, to this event, which is entitled Landscape Futures in the 21st Century, Landscape Leaders in an Intergenerational Dialogue. Just a bit first about the Landscape Research Group. We were founded in 1967, so we've been around a good long time. And we're a global community with a shared interest in landscape from natural to urban design. And our staff, board of trustees, members, and partners represent a broad range of disciplines: geographers, planners, landscape architects and urban designers, archaeologists, anthropologists, and ecologists, to list but a few. This diversity is fundamental to a holistic understanding of landscape, its evolution, and its future. Membership of the Landscape Research Group is open to anyone who has an interest in landscape and the ways we shape and are shaped by the places in which we live. I should say that our members are very broadly constituted from artists, lay researchers, academics, and we provide grants, opportunities, and we support research networks, and we are publishers of the journal Landscape Research. I'm standing in for Theano Turkenli, who unfortunately can't be with us this evening, although she's lurking online there. So Theano, hello to you, and I'll do my very best to be as warm as you would be. Just a bit from the introduction to this is that current and ongoing polycrises seem to be laying a heavy imprint on the landscape around the world, with grave, complex, and unprecedented repercussions in the realms of economy, energy, and the environment, and in society. Rising rates of globalization, consumerism, and commoditization, increasing mobility, the fourth technological revolution, and so on have been instigating a worldwide transformation in spatial organization and management, signaling an enormous transformation in the way in which we live. Human landscapes are becoming increasingly vulnerable to uncontrolled climate change and related disasters. And I should probably also say the rise of contemporary fascism. Intense extractive and expropriating activities, rapid land use changes, threats to public health and well-being, financial setbacks and depressions, etc. At the same time, these challenges may be viewed as opportunities for better future landscape stewardship and care than in the past. We have asked our speakers today to respond to three questions, which they may, to one extent or another. The questions are: how do you anticipate and or envision the future of landscape and of landscape research in our era of multiple crises? Big questions. What do you recommend in response to and remediation of these upcoming challenges and opportunities? And what could the role of the Landscape Research Group be in this? And of course, also the role of landscape education, as we're in a building which is devoted to that. This building houses the Landscape Architecture Department of the Bartlett School of Architecture, the Masters in Architecture and Historic Urban Environments, and now Space Syntax. So quite a range of spatial disciplines represented here. I'll give some short biographies. Go ahead and do everyone's biography before we begin, and then I'll hand it over. Marc will be our first speaker. Marc Antrop is Professor Emeritus at the University of Ghent. To say that he is a geographer and a landscape ecologist is to seriously underestimate his great range and impact in the field of landscape research. He's so much more than just those two things. And here are a couple of wonderful lines about Marc's impact by Jesper Brandt in Jesper's paper. It's called Marc Antrop, a revolutionary transdisciplinary scientist or traditional geographer, ? Few people might consider Marc Antrop to be a radical revolutionary. Within his academic life, he certainly is, always at the edge of the disciplines, where the battles of scientific development and cooperation with the solution of practical problems of the real world are fought. He has been an outstanding and vigorous fighter for integration in landscape research. I think those are wonderful lines. Margherita Cisani, who's joining us online, is a research fellow in geography at the University of Padua, who works across history, geography, and anthropology to address questions in everyday landscapes, tourism, resources, active mobility, and landscape education and training. In recent years, she has published an impressive number of impactful essays and is certainly amongst the younger landscape researchers to watch closely in the future. Amy Strecker is Associate Professor at the Sutherland School of Law, University College Dublin. Her research focuses on landscape, law, and culture, combining legal analysis with interdisciplinary and cross-cultural perspectives. She's currently the principal investigator of Property Injustice 2020 to 2026, an ERC-funded research project investigating the role of international law in facilitating spatial justice and injustice through its conception of property rights in land. She has published widely, and her monograph, Landscape Protection in International Law, published by Oxford University Press, is considered the definitive text on landscape and law, providing the first comprehensive overview of the international and European framework for landscape protection, including cultural, environmental, and procedural rights perspectives. And finally, Tim Ingold is Professor Emeritus at the University of Aberdeen and former Chair of Social Anthropology. His illustrious body of work reaches across the 4 A's: anthropology, archaeology, art, and architecture, fields in which his books are canonical. These include The Perception of the Environment, Lines, A Brief History, Being Alive, Essays on Movement, Knowledge, and Skill, and Making, Anthropology, Archaeology, Art, and Architecture. His influence, of course, stretches far outside even those 4 broad disciplines. With that, I believe we can get started. And Marc, if you would be kind enough to start, we'll have short 10-minute presentations from each, and then what we'd like to do is throw it open to a panel discussion to invite questions from the floor, so that it can be a lively, as we say in the blurb, an intergenerational dialogue. So, and Marc, you're going to stand to present. If you'd like, I can run your slides for you, and you can sit there.
Well,
just say next slide, and I'll do it for you.
Maybe you have to do several times.
I'm happy to.
Just another. Okay. When I got the invitation and the 3 questions, I was starting brainstorming about what I could say about these, really brainstorming, not structured. But simultaneously, I was preparing a lecture for the University of Tartu now on Monday, and therefore I was trying to order my ideas a little bit, and that are some of the slides I used there. And why I think it's useful to show them is that when you speak about crisis, then you must have an idea of when, where, and how strong they have been. And so I have been using a simple tool, the Google Ngram viewer, in which you can ask 1 word, and it counts into the 5 million scanned books Google Books has achieved already, and it counts for every year the percentage of occurrence in it. And the first thing I was thinking about landscape in different languages, how do they evolve in time, and what are the paths they showed. And I started in 1800. You can start from 1500 in Google Books, but 1800 is a nice starting point, because that's the beginning of landscape sciences and disciplines, approximately this time. And there you have the different languages and their parts, and you see they are not the same. That's the biggest problem, I think, in the whole thing. And especially at the end, when I start here around 2000, that you see we have a growth, enormous growth, and then a break, a depression. We are trying to struggle out at the moment. And that's a little bit the focus I would like to say. In the different languages, we have different responses, and everyone is doing it in a different way. And can you?
Yes.
No, yeah, another one. Yeah, and
yeah, I think we need the people online are saying we need the mic.
The letters A to F, they show some important things that happened. The blue line, there's the German use of the word. And you see that dominates the whole period until approximately little before 2000. The other languages are more similar with lower impact. Germany during the 19th century were the most important publisher of books in the world. You see that clearly. The peak A, that is when Immanuel Kant started lecturing about physical geography and anthropology. And then later von Humboldt took a little bit over. Then the B peak, that is around the interbellum and the Second World War. That we should keep in mind. And then the last peak we see, where all the others come together, that is the preparation for the European Landscape Convention, as it was called then. Now, you see that German dropped down. Now, English, you think should take over. It's not completely true. It's Italian and France. And that are the two languages which were dominant in the preparation of the European Landscape Convention. Important is F, because there you see the difference of the parts of the British English and the American English. And although in the beginning they are together, but now they're completely diverging, and the word landscape for both means something completely different. I think that's an important issue we should consider. Now, I'll leave that for the moment. So there is a crisis going on. The crisis increases to the end of the previous century, and we see it now in that graph, especially after 2010. It starts with the financial global crisis of 2008. And then suddenly that's now the use of the word landscape, but you can also see, if you take another slide, in the landscape disciplines. Yeah, okay. Next one.
Sorry, I'm trying to work around
Tick. Just tick. Yeah, okay.
Is
Now,
that the right one?
We see the similar things happening with the disciplines. We see it's something that is converging today. So the first question that was posed was the future of the landscape, of landscape research, and the multiple crises, polycrisis, as you told them. I think it's a very good idea. All these crises are coming together and they are reinforcing each other. And we should put that in the scope of the great acceleration, put here down. You know, the great acceleration is a term from the Anthropocene, where we see that all processes, all emissions start growing in an exponential rate. And that starts about in, let's say, the 18th century, that becomes quite visible. But from the year 1950, it is accelerating so that it really takes the steep slope of the traditional mathematical exponential function. And that's the period we are in. That means everything increases in magnitude, increases in speed, and that's what is characteristic for all the crises that are happening now. So that's quite important, and there is no indication at all we can reverse or bend down an exponential growth for the moment. So that will continue for some while. Now, how does it influence landscape research, those crises? Well, there are two factors. First, the direct influence is that landscapes transform. So landscape changing is something which is increasing in speed and in magnitude. That's the first thing. But there is also an indirect effect, and that is the way the interest of policymakers is moving away from a soft aspect like landscape towards more hard issues like climate change, economical growth, and all the features which are vital. Let's say landscape is not considered as vital, and we will see why that is so. So anyhow, the indirect effect is that the means for making landscape research as such is decreasing, or it's spreading over other hard issues now. The future of the landscape, as we are now witnessing, is a fast change, unstoppable as it seems. But is that the problem? The landscape changes naturally. All landscapes have been changing. So that's the inherent nature of landscape. So what's the problem? That's the real question. It's maybe we are nostalgic in thinking the beautiful landscapes of the past. Should we keep them? Well, there is one important rule. When they are not functional anymore for our needs today, they will disappear anyhow. So that means that the way we should study them and the way we should treat them in research is also becoming different. There is, with the relaunch discussion of the Landscape Convention, that's a discussion in the Council of Europe now. There has been in October a meeting about that, and the chairman of the Council of Europe Landscape Convention, as it is called now, Riccardo Priore, expressed it in a way that it is a human right, landscape, and when we have no humans, there will be no landscape. I do not agree with the guy, not at all. Nature will find its way, and landscape will be there without or with people. But landscape is not something that exists because we are spectators of the landscape. As a landscape ecologist, mice and rats and birds also see their landscape, a landscape which is vital for them. So nature will find the solution, but maybe it's up to us to see if we are part of that solution or not. one important issue, I think, is that the causes of these faster and faster transformations are not direct in control by people. And the reason for that is that the competences of making changes or steering the landscape are different. There are two groups. There's the group which is called the ones who have the direct influence, and that are mainly the landowners and the tenants who do the things in reality. And there's a growing, a larger group of indirect influences, which is called the symbolic competences by Hegerstrand, and that is all policymakers, all people thinking about the landscape, all academics, all researchers. They try to offer solutions. They try to formulate scenarios for the future, but they seldom execute them. The final execution is done by the people who live in the landscape and who work in the landscape. Now, the problem is that the complexity of the changes is becoming so big. If you look at the systems analysis of the driving forces of all the interacting processes going on, it's very difficult to comprehend. So there is an opportunity there that maybe with artificial intelligence we can understand or try to grasp that complexity. But I guarantee you, if we leave it to artificial intelligence to make the decisions, we lose our competence to do something with the landscape. And that's also an important issue we should take notice of. Now, in the graphs, you show that the word landscape has different meanings. That is because the word etymological landscape is has multiple meanings, and that means it is multi-interpretable. And that can lead to linguistic confusions when you meet together in an international or in an interdisciplinary way. So that's maybe the first thing we have to do, try to find a common language we all agree upon to work with the landscape. And that is what, in fact, the formal definitions, definitions, that were created by international bodies like UNESCO for the cultural landscape and the Council of Europe for the Landscape Convention. That is an agreement about that is how we will talk about the landscape, and that are the meaning of each of the words. When you start interpreting landscape from the linguistic part, then everyone has his own right and his own interpretation, and you will have the Tower of Babel in a few years' time. So that's for sure. So we should stick to that, and we should surely try to do to try to talk in a common language. There is another aspect which was also mentioned in the leaflet, that is we try to be intergenerational. And my experience is that very often young researchers try to reinvent things our grandfathers had already discovered and invented and applied. But that's too much general old theory, history. You don't study that anymore. So you try to invent a new, and then maybe you are important. I don't know. But when it comes to landscape, an approach we need is not only interdisciplinary, we should look at the landscape as a holistic unity, the whole, where all these factors come together. And it's very difficult for young people to start thinking holistically. It's very difficult because it is, for some, it's completely vague, it's philosophical, and you do not see how you can apply it practically. Believe me, you can use it very practically, but it has, it demands a different attempt of thinking about it. And what I see that is that many young researchers, but it can be older ones as well, but from disciplines that are young and who start specialization in landscape studies, that they try to upscale their thinking to a landscape level. We see that, we saw that with the biologists. Instead of studying the pond and the riverbed, they are moving up to a larger scale and they see the river basin as a whole system and try to work with that. Architects are doing the same. Architects, instead of having a project, a small project, are now moving to a larger scale. So upscaling is in fact a way they try to promote their specialization, and some of them call it holistic, but that is not necessarily the case. So I conclude the last role of the landscape research group. I think what you're doing now is maybe the most important thing, because the brainstorm between all actors from different disciplines is very, very, very needed. So if you offer platforms for that interdisciplinary exchange of ideas, for the dialogue, which is absolutely necessary, then I think that's the right way to go.
Thank you so much, Marc. Excellent. So I just need to get out of this presentation, and Margherita, you will be next.
Okay. Do you have my slides, or can I share? Shall I?
I'm about to share them.
Okay.
Right now. Can you see them?
Not yet. I see I see the very interesting graph that Marc Antrop showed.
Okay. I need to change what I'm sharing then. No.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Just a moment. I need to bring them over onto the correct screen here as well.
Okay, thank you. So I only have 3 images, and I think that you will be able to understand when to switch from one to the next one. And it's only a way that you don't just see my big face there, but you will see a nice picture. And so, shall I start?
Yes.
Okay. So thank you very much, and then good evening, everyone. First of all, thank you to the Landscape Research Group organization and to Teano and Tim for inviting me to speak. And it's a very inspiring panel, and I'm honored to be part of it. And I'm sorry not to be present in person, but I am 8 months pregnant, and it would be problematic to travel from Italy. So thank you for allowing me to speak online. So to address the first question at the heart of tonight's discussion, as you see, I chose to begin with an image and to present a brief account. What you see in the image is a vegro in the hills near Padova in northeast Italy. Vegro is a term in the local dialect that means old, and it is used to describe these landscapes, that are semi-natural dry grasslands and scrublands that were once cultivated but now are abandoned. Despite their unproductive aspect, these areas were once sparsely cultivated and grazed, and are still of value as habitats for the presence of rare orchids. Being now abandoned, the vegetation tends towards the advancement of shrub and woodland, with the consequent loss of these protected species. Today, the vegri are threatened both by the advance of the forest, but also by the invasion of allochthonous species and by nearby intensive cultivation or recreational practices. Climate change is only apparently not part of the picture, as it is not direct a threat, but these are arid areas accustomed to water scarcity. However, the entire area is increasingly suffering from droughts, and the landscape of the Vegro speaks to us of how it could be possible to address the changing climate by challenging the rigidity of the society-nature dichotomy. And I'm explaining why I believe this. This landscape is situated within the Colli-Ogani Regional Park, a protected area that has been recently recognized as a UNESCO Biosphere Reserve. And the permanence of the Vegro and its biodiversity is therefore guaranteed by sporadic maintenance effort carried out by the protected area. The land is, though, owned by a wine grower, and this point is really connected to what Marc was saying before about the direct and indirect roles in changing and in the competencies regarding landscape. So this part, this land, this plot is owned by a wine grower. And in the picture, my colleague Giada Peterle and I are interviewing him because rather than following the example of his neighbors who are increasingly giving in to the Prosecco monoculture, he has a project in mind that would see the experimentation of a particular vine variety recovered from those cultivated in the past, which could coexist with the conservation of this landscape's biodiversity. Being drug resistant, this experimentation could teach us something about possible retro-innovation in agriculture in view of the necessary adaptation to the climate crisis. Unfortunately, this project is currently impeded due to the lack of institutional support for cultivating within these protected habitats. Conversely, the exploitation and commodification of these landscapes, the surrounding hills that you see, as aesthetically pleasing recreational areas is permitted, if not actively encouraged by the park. So I've selected this particular case study because I believe it is both distinctive and representative of a wider, increasingly common phenomenon across many landscapes and potentially across all landscapes. In the academic debate, as we just discussed, it is clear that landscape is not static and it is in a state of constant change. It is a relational and processual entity, and its interpretation requires us to overcome the dichotomy between nature and culture. However, this is not evident in the public debate. Furthermore, in the context of the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene, talking about landscape as well as about heritage and nature may appear to be anachronistic if we restrict our understanding of these concepts to their most superficial definitions: landscape as an aesthetically pleasing scenery, heritage as a monument, and nature as an untouched area. And if we consider them as separate domains, these concepts are certainly inadequate to explain many of the contemporary dynamics. From my perspective, as a white academic woman based in the global north, particularly in Italy, I believe the following challenges currently require the most attention, not to mention the many other crises, war, conflicts, energy, and other. Thinking about what to say, of course, I had to choose, and I chose these challenges, but this doesn't mean that I don't think that there are many other challenges, including those that Tim mentioned before. So these are the topic that I think could be interesting to think about. So first of all, the management of these anthropocenic hybrid landscapes, where more than natural and more than human dynamics overlap, is a really complex issue. And there is the need to balance intense artificialization on one side with situation of abandonment and rewilding. And this is linked to the second challenge I see, which is the increasingly stereotypization, beautification, and consequent commodification of the landscape, which stems also from homogenizing forms of heritage making, often used as a branding strategy, that tend to flatten and depoliticize the landscape, delegitimizing alternative perspectives, or to restrict access only to certain categories of people or animals. The eco-tourist with e-bikes in this context, for example. Both of these challenges are somehow present in the image of the vegro, in the forefront or in the back side of the picture, and in its surroundings. And both relate to the tension and contradictions between landscape conservation and development, and to the distinction between passive landscape consumption practices and active and conscious landscape co-creation processes. So in the next slide, if you move to the next, just to change the picture, it doesn't change much. It's just another picture, sorry. But with respect to the future directions, I see I may not be very innovative, but as probably in line with what Marc was saying before, I believe in the old but gold interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. And in particular, I believe in the strength of the interconnection between the landscape debate with mobility studies, heritage studies, and in particular with political ecology. So regarding the contribution of mobility studies, we had the opportunity in the past I had the opportunity to cross-fertilize some thoughts with Tim Ingold during a joint seminar that were organized in 2020, entitled Unruly Landscapes, together with Lynn Pierce and the Center of Mobility Research in Lancaster, and the Mobility and the Humanities Center at the University of Padua, where I work. And we already thought and exchanged a lot of thoughts about it, but I wanted to mention this link with mobility studies because I think that it is crucial and fundamental in mobilizing our interpretation on and in the landscape. Secondly, heritage studies is a field of research that for some time now has intersected with the one of landscape, precisely with many contributions within the Landscape Research Journal, and is leading, in my opinion, towards very interesting and promising directions, with especially with a decidedly post-colonial approach. For example, as in the context of the Heritage for Global Challenges Center, recently established in New York by Emma Waterton. And finally, I see that the intersection of the contemporary debate on landscape with the one that pertains to political ecology is promising, especially in relation to the challenges regarding the new ways to think about the conservation of nature, understood as a social nature. With respect to this theme, I have in recent years found the proposal of Bram Buscher and Robert Fletcher very interesting. In their book, The Conservation Revolution, they speak about this revolution in the conservation of nature based on conviviality and on overcoming the nature-culture dichotomy, but also on a strong critique of the capitalist nature of mainstream conservation. And in their book, Buscher and Fletcher also explicitly refer to the need to think of nature as integrated landscapes. So I believe that the people in the room and online have a lot to say on this. What do we mean with by post-capitalist integrated landscapes? Can we understand them as a strategy, as an approach to address the real causes of the crisis we are experiencing? How can landscape studies contribute to this? And so for the last question, what can we do and what the landscape research group could do? So just another picture if you want to switch the slide. I think that asking what can we do, what the landscape research group can do is very useful and honest question, so thank you. And personally, I believe that the landscape research group is a reality that has long since implemented a number of concrete actions and changes in approach that go in this direction. As Theano well mentioned in her recent welcome letter that she just sent a few days ago. For my part, I had the opportunity to and the fortune to benefit from the research fund in the past, and I think that this is one of the lines of action that should be pursued and strengthened. I also think that, as you were saying before, Tim, that teaching, communication and awareness raising within and beyond the academy are fundamental, and these could be strengthened even only, I imagine, through a formal landscape research group support that could give greater visibility and authority to the countless small initiatives that we all undertake in an increasingly complex, competitive, and social impact-oriented academic context. And speaking about the academic context, I cannot fail to mention the necessary contrast with this neoliberal drift that universities are undergoing. Competition, productivity on multiple fronts, and shorter and ever shorter time frames. It probably is because I am about to go on maternity leave, and that I've never been a very productive person, and I don't know, I really thank you for the presentation, for my introduction, but I don't really see me in that way. Anyway, I think that rediscussing the performance, the excellence and rankings, and celebrating more ordinary work, slowing down, doing little and doing it well with care and respect is a strategy that also the landscape research group could continue to pursue to counteract this sort of bulimia of request projects, initiatives, and information that surrounds us, not just by complaining, but acting differently. So thank you very much to everyone for the attention.
Wonderful, thank you. Thank you, Marc.
So we are going to come back to this room now, if I can find my cursor again and stop sharing. Here we go. So Amy, it is your turn.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you to Theano and Tim for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be here with the other speakers as well. Yes, I have a lot to say, but I'm going to keep it very short, and I might pick out some themes from the previous two talks and just elaborate in relation to my own research, which is focused really for a long time on the role of law in landscape governance. Law is often forgotten about, it's not really, there's not a lot of legal scholars working on landscape, whereas landscape is obviously a major focus for many different disciplines, including landscape architecture and ecology and geography and so on. And I suppose one of the reasons for that is because law likes things to be clear, likes defining things, likes classifications and categorizations. And yes, landscape has emerged within the vocabulary of international law since the 1960s, but in quite discrete and separate fields of law. So you have cultural heritage law, and we have cultural landscapes within cultural heritage law. We have environmental law, which considers landscape as an element and part of the environment, but often in scenic terms. And we also have, interestingly, some emerging procedural environmental rights, which acknowledge the right of people to participate in the planning process, the right of access to information, and the right to participate in the right to access justice. We also do, in theory, have a cultural human right to landscape if we think about culture as including a way of life relating to a particular place. So I'm kind of interested in aspects relating to rights, human rights, rights to landscape, spatial justice, questions of justice and fairness in relation to landscape, who has access to landscape, who's excluded from landscape, who makes decisions about what is landscape in the first place. So I'm really concerned with these kind of questions. And I have to disagree with Marc. I do think human rights are relevant, probably for the reason that in the legal framework that we have, human rights, in fact, is the only it's the only way in which an individual or a group of individuals can challenge a state decision before a higher court. So it's really, apart from believing in it on an ethical or theoretical level, from a very practical perspective, there has to be some mechanism to be able to challenge a state decision. And that only mechanism that we have in international law is, in fact, human rights courts.
That, you know, what I do not agree is that landscape do not exist and you have no people looking at it.
Well, that depends on your concept of landscape, I suppose. But I mean, it's true, of course, you know, landscapes can go on beyond human beings. But I suppose I've always been interested in the human landscape, and that can include the ecology and the natural elements that people perceive to be important. But it's about sort of making sure that there is an opportunity in the planning process to articulate those things as well. So yes, so back to the questions anyway. So some of the challenges I see coming forward are, despite the fact that we have these, let's say, more progressive norms in law, and, you know, we have a convergence, we have within cultural rights recognizing, you know, a right to a particular way of life, and also relationships with the land, including cosmology and all of these things. And on the environment side, we have an increasing recognition of the cultural aspects of landscape. So we do have this convergence, breaking the culture-nature dichotomy. How that translates into practice is still very, it's quite non-existent in the planning process at the operational level. And we have, that's why I think rights are important, you know, both procedural rights and human rights. But the problem is what we're seeing now is kind of a more aggressive market state and an increasing neoliberalization of the planning process and development more generally. And that's walking back a lot of the potential that we have in these emerging international legal norms relating to landscape. And just some examples. So we have the Green New Deal, the EU's New Deal to transition towards a green economy. And that sounds ostensibly positive, but then if we look into what that entails, it entails more extraction of minerals for things like wind turbines and solar batteries and lithium batteries for electric cars. So we still have to think about, there's a material and a landscape consequence to all of these new technologies. There's a race for critical rare earth minerals. I mean, in Ireland at the moment, in the county of Leitrim, we have 43 prospecting licenses alone in one county. Ireland is very much sort of opening itself up as a mining destination. But often this repeats some of the similar process of fossil fuel extraction. You know, it degrades local landscapes, often violates human rights, destroys the water and soil, and has all of these knock-on effects. And yet somehow that's not as visible as it should be when we're discussing things like green growth, which is an oxymoron. Let's see. Yes, there's this landscape writer, Tim Robinson, and he's done a lot of work, written a lot about Connemara and the west of Ireland and the Burren and the Aran Islands. And he's another Tim. There's a lot of Tims interested in landscape. But Tim Robinson has this collection of essays, and it's called Experiments on Reality. And the last essay is called Land Without Shortcuts. And he recounts the story in his essay of being invited to a debate on whether there should be a wind farm on one of the Aran Islands off the west coast of Ireland. And he's on a small plane, and the passenger beside him is a young and enthusiastic young gent who works for one of these new technology companies, and they both get off the plane. They extract, you know, they get off the small plane and stretch out in the air, and Tim Robinson is hit immediately by this storied landscape, you know, and the 1,000 miles of Atlantic Ocean, and 1,000 wildflowers hitting his nostrils, and his passenger says, kilowatt hours. And I just thought that was a great sort of juxtaposition of the way they both saw the landscape, one in a utilitarian way, oh, this is great, you know, and Tim Robinson appreciating, oh, much more nuance in the local landscape. And I think that that's where landscape research can contribute to some of these global challenges, the triple planetary crisis, you know, to get away from this carbon tunnel vision, which in a way is not really addressing the problem. Emissions have been rising year on year since the Paris Agreement, despite the fact that we have an increase in carbon offset schemes. And this is really just a way for polluters to keep on polluting, and it's based on sort of, you know, an illusion of moving these invisible credits from one place to another. And it still relies on the sacrifice of other zones in the global south, but also in peripheries in Europe as well. And there is a disintegration because of that. And there's also an increasing centralization in the name of green technology. And you witness this now in Ireland. Very recently, we had a new planning and development legislation overhaul, and it was the largest piece of legislation in the history of the state, nearly 800 pages. And what it does is it centralizes the planning process. It provides for a strategic development to be decided by the minister. And what that does is it opens the possibility to bypass the democratic planning process. So bypass the normal channels of, you know, public participation and consultation. And literally decide, have a minister, whatever minister is responsible, in this case it would be the Minister for Housing and Planning and Local Government, on what constitutes strategic development. And that can be, in Ireland, that's data centres. Data centres are nearly consuming 30% of the electricity grid, of the air grid. You know, and then, you know, for what, really? I mean, that has a physical imprint in the landscape, the massive consumption of water and energy. And it's just, you know, and AI is going to make that worse. So there's always a physical, a landscape impact from all of these sort of new technologies. And I think landscape research can contribute to that, because it takes into account place more than, you know, sort of other let's say other concepts of land do, especially property, because that's the dominant property is the dominant way in which land is considered in law, both in national law but also in certain areas of international law, where you have property rights of investors, and they often trump the real lived-in rights of communities living in places who are sometimes trying to protect the landscape, and are often painted as NIMBYs, even though they're just trying to uphold, you know, the status, the habitats, or whatever it is. They're trying to uphold the law in the face of a state not wanting to do that. So let me see. And the last question then. And what role could the LRG play in this? Well, I think the LRG is already doing a great job. I think it's really great that there's a broadening out of landscape research beyond Europe and North America, because it's been dominated by, you know, European and North American scholars for a long time. I agree with Margherita. I do think talking beyond the academy is needed, and you know, especially with decision makers, because we have to always bear in mind that the reason why landscape is changing, and you know, in certain ways, is also heavily influenced by certain industries and their lobbies, and they have massive resources. And you know, there's more lobbyists now at COP, you know, than there are NGOs, environmental NGOs. So you know, but I do think there's a role for researchers to play in a way. I mean, everyone's, you know, has trouble with time. We're all struggling to find the time to just do our own jobs. But, you know, I do think there is a role for us as well, you know, for scholars and researchers and teachers and practitioners to sort of, I do think we need to make a more coordinated effort to almost compete with the lobbyists, you know, because often decision makers are, you know, it's easy to adopt a proposal if you've heard it so many times by a certain lobbyist and you're not aware of, let's say, all of these other sort of landscape norms that exist or all these other obligations, you know. Let me see. Yes, and I do agree with Mark. Landscape can be a chaotic concept. And that's what Mike Jones actually called it. He said it's a chaotic concept. So that presents a problem because we still have in planning law in many countries the idea of landscape as only scenic. And that can be a problem because sometimes landscape is even used to rubber stamp or make acceptable projects which are not in favour of landscape integrity. So I take an example in Northern Ireland right now. There's a gold mine application that's gone through, and it spends a lot of its time justifying it on the basis of landscape mitigation measures, that it won't be visually obtrusive, you know, obtrusive in the landscape, and it won't really affect the area of its standing natural beauty. But this landscape is also a habitat for salmon, for pearl mussel. It's also you know, a special area of scientific interest. It's a dark sky observatory. It has about 7 designations for its wetlands and bogs. It's the home of the people living there who have very, very close place attachment with this landscape. And for all of these reasons, they do not want to mine. But landscape is being used as almost a way to make it acceptable. So that's when we really have to sort of, I think, make the point that it's not just about scenic and visual aspects, it's about more than that. And that's where the integrating concept comes in. Landscape is very much an integrating concept. And it is a challenge because it requires taking into account the natural, the cultural, the social aspects. And I suppose, you know, that's a challenge for decision makers. But I do think landscape goes beyond other concepts because of the fact that it is so so all-encompassing in a way. But yeah, maybe there's more work to be done to explain this sort of the multifaceted and integrating notion of landscape, and that also challenges our culture-nature dichotomy, which is convenient if we like to think about ourselves as separate from nature, and that nature can be commodified and, you know, made into a property right, you know, for profit. So I think I'll stop there. I've rambled a bit, but thanks very much.
But you rambled well. So we will go over to our final speaker, which is Tim Ingold. And if I can just figure out how to go to speaker view.
Okay.
Sorry, Tim, I'm just trying to.
Right, let's let me know when you're fixed.
There we go.
Okay, thanks. So you can hear me all right?
Yes.
Good. So Mark mentioned in his talk how there are many different words for landscape in different languages, and that this counts. And I wanted to start with the French version, paysage, or the Italian paesaggio. Both words come from, I believe, both words come from the Latin pagus, which incidentally, from which incidentally we also get the word page, and I'll come back to that. But pagus meant roughly an area of inhabited land with its farms and fields. So I've been thinking about what it actually means to inhabit such a rural landscape. And I would start by thinking about the relations between generations, between ancestors and descendants, and how, if you're farming the land, you work fields that have been farmed by your fathers, by your parents and grandparents before you. You take on those fields, you work them, and you pass them on to your descendants, not really as an inheritance, but more like a prolongation. In a vineyard, for example, we had the example of wine growing, and when you grow wine, you basically follow the roots already laid down by ancestral wine growers, the ones who came before you, and through judicious pruning and replanting, you allow those tendrils to continue to bear fruit. So in that relationship between ancestors and descendants, there is no overtaking the ancestors. The ancestors are always before you, and you are following in their ways, just as if you were going along a footpath. And suppose when you were young, you walked a footpath with your parents. And then when you're older, you'll be walking that same footpath with your children. Then you're always following in the footsteps of the ancestors who've gone before you. And that's what it meant, I think, for people to inhabit a living landscape, to always be following in the footsteps of the ancestors who went before you, and at the same token, to look after those who are coming after you. So look after is a beautiful expression, because it conveys this idea that whilst you're facing in the direction of your ancestors, you're also looking back to care for those who are following after you. And that's the way in which living landscapes were created. And incidentally too, it's in that context that the words nature and culture derived their original meanings. These are ancient words. They go back at least 2,000 years. And nature, for example, in Lucretius, The Nature of Things, nature is a power distributed throughout the cosmos to give birth to new life. That's what nature is, a power to give birth to new life. And culture, which comes from colere, to cultivate, refers to undertaking that work of looking after that allows newborn life to flourish. So actually, we can reclaim the ideas of nature and culture in those original senses. Nature is the power to give of the world, to give birth to life. Culture is our responsibility to look after that power. And as Hannah Arendt always argued, it's the primary responsibility of parents to introduce new people, that is children, into old ways, and to inspire in those children a love for that world. She called it amor mundi, love for the world, because only if children are inspired by that love for old ways do they have a chance to renew those ways into the future. So that's the way in which landscapes were inhabited and carried on generation after generation for centuries. But then, as we all know, something happened. And I think what happened is that following the doctrines of the Enlightenment and programs of agricultural improvement that went along with that, the idea was that we should turn our backs on the ancestors. Instead of following in their footsteps, we should turn round and head in the opposite direction, so that the ancestors are then behind us, or perhaps even beneath us, and we're facing a future in the opposite direction, a future of progress, of advance, of increasing wealth and growth, and so on. And that's the point at which the Great Acceleration begins. It's as though we're suddenly motoring along in the fast lane of technological development, of economic growth. And now we see nature and culture, as it were, in the rear view mirror of our car. Imagine that we're driving along a motorway at increasing speed, and we look in the rear view mirror and we see disappearing behind us those landscapes. And we call them, oh, that's nature and that's culture. And that's the point, I think, when we start thinking of relations between generations in terms not of prolongation, prolonging the ways, old ways, or rejuvenating, renewing old ways, but in terms of inheritance. Because the thing about inheritance is that it splits off what is to be inherited from the processes of life and transfers them as a package to a new generation that is layered over the one before, the previous generation sinking down. So there's a move from thinking about the prolongation of landscapes to thinking about the inheritance of landscapes. And that's why I think the whole discourse of heritageization is so dangerous. It leads us to think of these landscapes as things, as objects of memory, of collective memory, to which we no longer belong because we're no longer inhabiting them, but which belong to us as some kind of collective human property that we then have to safeguard for the for posterity. So that, I think, is where the problem lies, and I don't think it's nostalgic to suggest that the way to deal with it is to turn around again, to reverse that disastrous about turn that led us to turn our backs on the ancestors, and actually see again, to fall in love again with those old ways, so that there's a chance not of preserving, but of renewing and rejuvenating those landscapes through processes of habitation. And that means moving from a logic of conservation to a logic of coexistence. And there's a really crucial difference, I think, between the two. It's one thing to conserve, to preserve, to try and keep a landscape in some aesthetically beautiful form for the sake of future generations. Is quite another thing to think of life as a process of coexistence with other people, with other beings, with trees, with animals, with grass, and so on, so that these lives are carrying along together and corresponding with one another, so that each generation's task is to prolong the life of its predecessor. I think that is the way to the future, not to impose new designs on the world, but to rejuvenate, to pick up past ways and carry them on. And I think we should design our educational programs in that spirit. And so I just wanted to get back to this, I think, fascinating point that the word page that we write on comes from the same source as the word for landscape. It's based on an analogy which would have been obvious to people in medieval times. In medieval times, most people knew how to handle a plough, but very few people knew how to write. The monks were the specialist writers, the scribes. So when the scribes tried to explain to everybody what they did in their writing, they said, well, it's like ploughing a field, you see. We do with our pen what you do with your plough. You know what it means to plough a field? You scribe this line in the fields. Well, that's what we do with our pens when we write. Of course, now it's the other way around. I mean, everybody knows how to write, but hardly anybody knows how to handle a plough. But the analogy is very striking, and it makes me think that that if we ask about, well, what is the future of landscape research, I think it's very tightly bound up with the future of writing. That's to say that writing and landscape were tied together from the beginning, let's say from 2,000 years ago, and I think they're still tied together. And I think what is happening to our ideas about landscape now has close parallels with what is happening to our ideas about writing. For example, we're seeing the loss of handwriting. We're seeing digitization, in which when we write, we simply tap things on keys. We are no longer inscribing our lines on the page with our own voice, with our own hand. And we're in danger, I think, of actually losing those skills of handwriting that have developed over millennia. We could lose them within a generation. And the same could happen, I think, with landscape, that we forget about what it actually means to inscribe our lives in the land, and how those inscriptions can be carried on generation after generation in the way that the lines of handwriting were. And my view is that digitization will not last. I don't think that the digital economy, I think it's environmentally unsustainable, and it probably won't last for more than another century. So it would be a good idea, instead of thinking about a post-human digital world, it might be a good idea to sort of think about a human post-digital world, which means actually looking after those skills of writing, of farming, of wine growing, and so on which people will depend in times to come. Just as we should look after the skills of writing. So I want to suggest that these two things are somehow are somehow related anyway, and linked to that, and this is the answer to the second question, if I just quickly remember what it was. What would I recommend in response to remediation of these challenges? I think it would be critical to relate our thinking about landscape to changing forms of land use. I mean, again, looking into the future, well, I think we can say three definite things. So imagine what life will be like for people in 300 years' time. I think we can say it was the Enlightenment was 300 years ago, and they might have wondered what kind of people would we be, and that's us. So what would life be like in 300 years' time? They won't have digital technology, that's for sure. They'll have language, they'll have fingers and toes, digits, they'll have a voice, they can speak. They'll probably mostly be living in cities because of high densities, but those cities will have to be places of food production because the long food chains, supply chains for food that go all around the world are obviously unsustainable. Many ancient cities, like in the Maya civilization, were themselves places of food production. So it's perfectly possible to think of the future city as a place where people grow food. That means, I think, that the disciplines of architecture and agriculture will necessarily come together. We'll see a unison of those disciplines. So what will happen then to our idea of landscape, and particularly to the idea of landscape architecture? And it's quite interesting the way in which landscape architecture seems sometimes to be thought of as this sort of relative or sometimes poor relative of architecture itself, and to be disconnected from the profession and the practices of agriculture. I think it's absolutely vital to bring these two together, and I would see the future of landscape research and a remediation of challenges we face now in bringing a whole idea about landscape under this integration of agriculture or land use in general way. It could be silviculture as well, agriculture, silviculture, viticulture, all these different ways of viewing the land, but bringing those together with our ideas about built form and architecture. And kind of that's what I wanted to say, so I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tim. That was a great place to end. I think it's terribly important to acknowledge that if we are going to deal with climate change and biodiversity loss, one of the things that we desperately need is landscape skills, landscape knowledge, and hands on the land. We need a peopled landscape in order to deal everywhere with the unequally distributed effects of all of these great challenges that lie before us. And I think actually we also need technology, but perhaps not in the way that we have become accustomed to thinking of technology, is in exactly the way that Tim describes, that we're putting things behind us and always moving into a glittering future. And I just I love quoting this line from Low Tech magazine, which is an absolute delight. And they talk about what they call low tech solutions. And they say, interesting possibilities arise when you combine old technology with new knowledge and new materials, or when you apply old concepts and traditional knowledge to modern technology. So I think that sort of an interpenetration of contemporary thinking and these kinds of skills and knowledge that we pass on from generation to generation, from our ancestors to the future is very important. I think because we have only about 15 minutes left, the best thing that we can do is to go directly to questions from the room. And also those of you who are online, I think the best way for us to take the questions is through the chat. So I think Charlotte here will keep an eye on the chat. And Charlotte, would you be willing to read the questions out when they come in? And then Rachel is going to handle the microphone. So this is Rachel Dominy. She is our Director of Operations, and this is Charlotte Mitchell. She is our Director of Communications and Membership. And they're both relatively new to the organization, doing a magnificent job, and we're thrilled to have them. So are there any questions in the room? I'm sure there must be.
Jala.
Thank you. Amazing talks and a lot to digest. My question is really to bring in another word, garden. Why? Because in post-colonial cultures, garden is the one that people understand, that is not corrupted by Western ideas, superficial ideas of landscape, and that is very much experiential and used and lived in, but at the same time denigrated because it's just a garden. So I'd love to hear more about this intersection of landscape and garden.
Would like to take that first. Marc?
I think the first factor is indifference, is the scale. In fact, the landscape has no borders. It has transitions to other landscapes. It's vast, it's extensive, it's not bordered, it's not an object. Gardens are bordered, they are objects. They can be large, as parks, for example, but there's a fundamental difference between a garden and a landscape as such. It's also a difference from the legal point of view, I think, very fundamentally. But the interesting thing is in the Arabic world, in Persian and in Arabic languages, landscape as such does not exist. It's only you have the town, the city, and the garden.
Would anyone else like to comment on that?
Can I just add one thing?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Just a commentary. Also in Arabic culture, paradise, which is limitless, is a garden. And it's the same word as garden. And so gardens, yes, they are bounded. I understand. But when you talk about cultivation, and that as a garden, a cultivated garden, cradle of civilization, for example, then it is boundless. So really, it depends on how you look at landscape and how you look at garden. And they're both culture shaping nature for specific needs, whatever they are. So I just wanted to add that about it.
In fact, the garden is a landscape. Not all landscapes are gardens.
Yes.
Sorry.
If I could just say, I quite like the idea of the garden, and maybe it's telling them because the microphone was a bit iffy when I first heard you speak, I thought I heard not garden, but God. And I thought, well, this is actually, there might be something in that, that there's something, there's something very beautiful about a garden. And I think that the people who coined the terms landscape or paysage back in medieval times would have had no hesitation in bringing in a spiritual dimension to the generativity of the garden in the landscape, and they wouldn't probably have made a distinction between them.
I think you're completely right. Parhus is indeed the oldest reference to it, and it's only taken over by the Romance languages. But landscape in English is in fact coming from a Dutch word, Landschap, which we find also in the German Landschaft, which consists of land and a suffix, and the suffix is quite strange. But the major word, land, is a territory which is lived by people, where people live. And in Dutch, schap means in fact the same as in German, schaffen, create, shape. In English, it's a little different, and also in the Scandinavian languages, where you have ship and skip, which refers more to a hidden relationship between the people and everything in that territory. And the difference between the basic notion of territory and scenery is inherent in that concept. That makes that land and land cover, as you rightly said, is nothing of landscape. It's a part, one of the characteristics of it. And scenery is the same. So misusing the word landscape by using the scenery as some kind of veil covering everything up is also misusing the basic concept of landscape.
I would add to that Kenneth Olwig points out that as with the word Landschaft, the shape and ship are right next to one another, so that you can actually talk about a landscape as a landship, as a relation, which I think is very, very, very useful as well.
Yes, also just to add to that, Kenneth Olwig's substantive understanding of landscape, he says, a substantive understanding of landscape comes from the early the early Scandinavian origins, which relate to law and social justice rather than social law and principles of justice rather than natural law and aesthetics. So he kind of shows that it is much more than seen, in the early origins. It's about community justice, body politic, and the relations between people and place. So, yeah.
We have another question in the front.
So many. So is this working?
Yeah.
So many questions. I was just thinking about the construction of landscape. We haven't talked about the sublime, but is that better? We haven't talked about the construction of the sublime, but actually it's not located only in history. I'm thinking about that process of protecting the landscape and the passing on of those things to other generations. But in terms of gardens, I went to a very brilliant conference looking at a garden in Palestine that had been taken within the settlements, pulled away from people, and one of the acts of resistance was to collectively retake that garden, to bind it once more to a shared landscape in a kind of ungated space, which was a very brave and talking of aesthetics, very beautiful conceptually and politically necessary piece of work. But I just want to dash quickly into the city, into our cities, and I run a project on 2 housing estates, and I'm always thinking about these green spaces and trying to think about working differently. And obviously we have obsessions with rewilding the city at the moment. And for me, there are questions of the complexity of who decides to do that. Who are the collaborators? Who gets to co-curate, but also more so in the use of the land. Just wanted to come back to something that you made me think about when you were talking about this non-binary positioning between human and other animals, and in fact the landscape itself as in this partnership. And the green spaces on these estates have these really beautiful desire lines that are made by animals. They're not made by people. And you have to do that kind of deep listening to a place to understand where those come from. And also you have to do deep listening to people who might have more knowledge than you have in order to learn about that kind of sensibility that otherwise we might miss.
Should we take one of the online questions as well? We'll do a couple at once, if that's all right.
So this is a question from Carla, and she's asked how the European Union can bridge the gap between landscape research, which underscores the critical role of landscape, and the policy frameworks for operationalizing the landscape concept in governance across its member states, especially given its decision not to endorse the Council of European Landscape Convention.
That sounds like one for Amy.
There's a debate over whether it would be a good idea at all for the EU to accede to the Council of Europe Landscape Convention. But I suppose going back to the question, there is a lot of EU-funded research on landscape and, you know, transfrontier research and all that, and very progressive. But the EU itself it has competence in environmental matters, and it has a lot of environmental directives and environmental legislation. Those only cover landscape to the extent that landscape is included within the definition of environment. You know, for example, in environmental impact assessment. But unfortunately, landscape is one of many elements and is often reduced to a scenic conceptualization in impact assessment alongside other factors. And cultural heritage isn't really a competence of the EU. So, and cultural heritage itself is narrowly construed in environmental impact assessment to mean archaeological heritage or architectural heritage and skyline views. It doesn't consider, you know, what Tim was referring to, so things like the intangible heritage, folklore, knowledge about a particular place, knowledge from the ancestors. You know, that, funnily enough, is now a part of the notion of cultural heritage in international law and in cultural rights, which acknowledges place-based knowledge relating to nature and the universe, relating to you know, previous generations and so on, but it's not an EU law. So yes, and there's a lot of work to be done trying to progress the idea of, I suppose, landscape within the EU frameworks. However, there is one area where there is room for, I think, incorporating landscape, and that's the Aarhus package. So the EU did sign up to the Aarhus Convention, which is on access to information, public participation, and access to justice in environmental matters, and that incorporates into the environmental impact assessment process public participation. That's where, you know, there can be some sort of movement, maybe. You know, but again, it comes back down to how states are requiring impact assessment to be carried out. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. The accession thing, I don't think the EU has outright refused. It's just more of a matter that Germany hasn't even signed up to the Council of Europe Landscape Convention yet. So you have to have a majority of states having signed up before you can actually accede on the part of the EU, because then Germany would have to, you know, it would.
I'm wondering, actually, Margherita, that seems to touch a little bit on the specific landscapes that you were sort of talking about, and maybe even the two questions start to come together there. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, when it comes to the sublime, of course, the Italian landscape comes to our mind, of course. Well, thank you for all the comments before and the question. It's really hard to address them properly, but I think that well, for what concerned the last comment, I think that in Italy we experienced a lot of impacts in terms of how the EU is funding policies, especially with the recovery plan funding. That they do not address landscape specifically, but we see the effect in how landscape is conceived and how landscape is transformed, especially in relation to tourism and recreation. And that once the sublime image of landscape or the wilderness concept comes in again in the discussion. And so the example that came to my mind is this idea of funding projects related to the improvement of tourism as the solution for deprived areas in the inner areas of Italy, but other countries in Europe, that somehow affect landscape in the way in which it is beautified, commodified, as also Amy was referring to. Yeah, that's the thing, the thought that I have in mind, but also in terms of the green communities opportunity that in a way could refer to landscape, but they actually don't. They speak about energy, forest management, water management, but yes, there is still a lot to do in terms of incorporating landscape in the EU policies and fundings. And regarding the garden topic, I also heard God in the beginning, and yeah, probably that is really connected. And I agree that probably the difference is that when we use garden, we stress on the culture shaping nature, while using landscape, it's more like balanced and less structure. No, there is no humans on top of the nature. So that's why probably I think that landscape could be a more integrated concept than garden. But on the other side, garden puts us in a place where we are using and changing, and so that could be interesting to point out to the humans not being just passive consumers and users, but also actors in the co-creation, as Tim was saying before, in the relational process of landscape transformation.
I think actually we've reached the end of the time that we have. It went really quickly. I'm not quite sure how that happened, but so it really just remains for me to thank all of our panelists for their wonderful presentations and their excellent thoughts and ideas. I think you've given us a lot to go away and think about. And thank you to the audience, both online and in the room, for your attention and your excellent questions. And keep an eye on the Landscape Research Group website for upcoming events. We do somewhere around 4 events per annum, and the next will be a research showcase in the spring. So research that we have funded over the past year will be presented at that point. It's a good opportunity to see what kinds of things we fund and maybe think about whether you might want to apply for something. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your evening.